everybody okay so far? Questions, worries?
No worries.
All right.
No worries.
So, the word complexity is problematic, right? Because it's a terrible name for a discipline. Because the word, like most words in natural languages, means multiple things. Like you may have a complex relationship with a friend, or with your mother, or with, so complex actually means things. You use the word in normal language. And so what I'd like to invite you is to open a second box in your brain somewhere for another meaning, because it's a different meaning. And plexus in Latin, hence these Nigerian women, plexus in Latin means to braid. That's the meaning of the word. And so complex is with braids. So complexity is the science of braided or interconnected systems. And that's so think of it as complex with a big C, and the complex relationship you may have with a girlfriend or a boyfriend is a complex with a small c. It's not the same thing. And you'll find in conversations, in work, etc., people will tend to mix, they may not know about this meaning, but they tend to mix them up. But realize that they really mean a really different thing. One is something actually complicated, and complex means this nature of interconnection and all these dynamics that we're learning about. So remember this image, maybe that's a way of anchoring the meaning of the word. It's not new. There's a beautiful essay by Hayek, a very famous economist from the 1930s, about the complexity of economics. And even going back all the way to Aristotle and the ancient Greek philosophers, they talk about complexity in this sense. So while as a discipline it's actually come into being in the past 30 years, roughly, since the Santa Fe Institute made it into a real academic discipline, it has a huge tail. And if you go into any decent thinker, whether it's Adam Smith or Kant or all the Enlightenment thinkers, they were all aware of this problem. And they wrote about it, but they generally said, okay, we don't have the tools or the mathematics to deal with these complex systems. So let's simplify and reduce things to a simple system. And let's assume the interconnections don't matter too much. And let's deal with the world that way. But most decent thinkers always made a big footnote saying, oh, this isn't a great idea, but we don't know what else to do. And so this word has quite a history and a really different meaning than the colloquial sense. And so one of the things is really to learn to distinguish in the vocabularies between a complicated and a complex system. So a car is a complicated system. An ensemble of cars traveling down a highway is a complex system, as we saw. Right? Because the interconnections determines its behavior. A jumbo jet is a complicated system. A stock exchange is a complex system. Now, it doesn't have to be enormously messy, because there's a famous problem in physics called the three-body problem, is the interactions of three planets with gravitation actually is a complex system. You can't model it perfectly. So there are things that are really simple in life that are already complex. And generally, the shortcut is to think anything that's interesting is complex, really. Nature, the economy, all these kinds of things. But the vocabulary is complicated versus complex. I have a friend who makes these videos about the cat and the clock. And if you take a clock apart and put it back together, it works. If you take a cat apart and put it back together, it doesn't work. And at its heart, at its essence, is because the bits are deeply interconnected, and they only work when the interconnections are all there. They're codependent, whereas a clock doesn't have that. They're interconnected in an engineering sense, right? But that's different than being completely codependent. So a clock is complicated and a cat is complex. So examples of complex systems, the human brain. Up to maybe 25 years ago, people wrote about the brain as that your emotions were here and your conscience was there and your language skills were there, all these kinds of bits. It's pretty clear that that's not the case. There's some localization of things, but it's actually a hugely complex systems, and it's the interconnections between the bits that determines its function. And there's a 1 billion euro EU project ongoing that looks at creating a software simulation of the brain, which is all about complexity. It's about understanding networks, emergent patterns, and all these kinds of things to try to get at that. The economy and markets are absolutely, without any doubt, complex systems. One of the great tragedy of macroeconomics in particular is that in the 19th century, late 19th century, they assumed, the famous assumptions you may have come across, that people are rational, that the economy is in an equilibrium. And those are exactly the assumptions to turn the complex system into a complicated system. So what they've done is they've taken out the complexity and turned it into a complicated system, and all macroeconomic models model a complicated system. And therefore they fail to predict anything interesting. Recessions, they can't predict growth, they have no financial sector inside of the model, etc. And so this is very much at the heart of a lot of the crisis actually we face in the world, is this inability of economics to integrate complexity. There are plenty, the guy I wrote the book with I showed you is a complexity economist. At the cutting edge of science, there are plenty of economists who understand this problem, who are working on it. But the economists that are in companies and in ministries, etc., typically don't have a clue about this problem. And this is a real thing. Traffic, we've seen, I won't bother you with traffic anymore. You'd be sick of traffic. Social networks are clearly the internet, everything social is intuitively clear, right? It's about interactions and are really complex systems. Nature is entirely about complexity, is ecosystems, but even at a protein level, inside of cells, it's all about complex systems. And I work a few days a week at the Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of Amsterdam, which is the Complexity Institute of the University of Amsterdam. And people look at all these kinds of problems. For example, there's a group trying to create a software simulation of the human immune system. Now, your individual immune system is by far the most complex system in the universe. It's more complex than the universe itself. Your immune system is absolutely mind-bogglingly complex. So they're trying to create a software simulation of that, and the ambition is that you would be able to test drugs and vaccines in software instead of on male mice, which is the current model. They don't test female mice, but they test male mice for all medicine, which doesn't sound like a great idea, but that's the way it works. But the interesting thing is that you see that the progress they're making on understanding the human immune system is super helpful for complexity economists who are trying to understand the economy, because actually the dynamics of these systems are quite similar. And the wonderful thing is that they share tools, and that enables you to work across disciplines, which in many cases is something that's really hard to do. Animal flocks are another, we've seen that too. A final example, which is easy to remember also, is, for example, a garden is a complicated system, because if you take out the tulips and replace them with roses, your garden is still fine. If in a tropical ecosystem you take out a particular species, it actually damages the overall system. So that's it's really the critical difference between a complex and a complicated system. So one way to, the critical image, I mean, this is probably the best definition of complex system that I know of, and also the image to sort of sear into your brain. So complexity is about the study of complex adaptive systems. That's the full terminology. It's complex adaptive systems. So they're complex, we've seen all that, braided. They're adaptive in the sense that they're dynamic. They adapt to their context, they adapt to their interactions, and their systems, because they're constituted of a whole bunch of pieces. Whether it's humans, you know, first-year students moving around the floor following silly instructions, or whether it's birds, or whether it's, you know, cars, and all these kinds of things. And so these systems are made up of interacting, interdependent agents. So agents is a core terminology of complexity, is what are the bits that, that follow simple rules. And this is really crucial, right, is that, you know, the normal, you'd think if you have a complex thing, then there must be a complex reason for the thing to be complex. But all complex systems follow simple rules, which is a really deep, I mean, that's a non-trivial thing, but take it from me, I can also try to explain to you why, but they always follow a small number of simple rules.
So does an agent always involve something with someone that has a conscience?
No. No. Complex, no, that's a really important free will, conscious, spirit, God, you know, whatever you want, actually don't come into this in particular. So there's a beautiful thing, do you know Studio Drift? It's an amazing design, if you haven't come up, if you're sort of halfway in design, it's an amazing design firm from Eindhoven. They do beautiful things. And they had this artwork this summer or last summer in Amsterdam where they took 500 drones and they programmed them with the same 3 rules as the birds, and they had them flock behind the central station above the A, and it works. I mean, not that birds have conscience, right? So it works with drones, the same thing that works with birds. And there's a, you know, just like you had a question about, you know, there are bigger questions. So what's the role of consciousness and free will in a complex system? And that's for over a beer, but it's not, but you can understand complexity, and there's more than enough intellectual running room in a sense without going there. And it doesn't mean that consciousness and all those things don't exist. But you don't need any of that to understand these magical properties of systems already. Is that an answer? Yeah. All right, so interacting interdependent agents that follow simple rules and influence one another, right? You recognize all these things, hopefully. And they influence their environment. They interact with their environment, which is where the birds are, you know, the micro fluctuations of the air and all these kinds of things that, and this causes the agents involved to co-evolve with their environment. So the picture here is you have these agents that interact with each other, and again, it's cars, birds, whatever it is. And as a result of that, there's an emergent collective behavior. So there's a new thing that's created, which is this collective behavior that has an odd relationship with the rules. Right? That's the critical thing. But it's real. It's not magic in the sense that if you take away the agents, the emergent property disappears. There's no flocking without birds. Which seems silly, but actually, you know, philosophically, it means that it's not, you've not created something independently in reality. It actually is contingent upon the underlying system existing, but it's actually something separate because you can't causally ascribe it to the individual agents. I mean, this sounds a little bit mysterious, but most of the world is made up of this, right? So this is actually quite crucial. The other thing to mess it up further is that the emergent behavior in turn influences the behavior of the agents. You know, one example was your decision to stand outside of the group because you see this collective mess and you say, well, I'm going to get out of here. So the emergent behavior in turn influences what some of the agents do. So there's a feedback loop there. This is kind of the core, you know, the most compact description of a complex system, of like a mental model. And of course, you have another mental model in your head is of a system of top-down order, a complicated system, which is quite simple, is that you've got somebody or something that sets the rules, and it basically tells all the agents what to do. So that's something that's been burned into your brain through, whatever it is, 15 or 18 years of education. And so this, the trick is to give this equivalent status as this in your mind space. And that's really hard, but it's actually quite rewarding, I would suggest. Does that help? Is that clear as an image of all the elements of how the thing works? And of course, it can get, all these agents don't have to be the same. You could have different kinds of agents. This could be a multi-scalar system. It could have multiple levels interacting with each other. So this thing can get a lot messier than this is, all the same birds that follow the same rules is kind of is already a simplification in many, certainly in nature. You'll have trees and animals and plants and microbes, and they're all interacting. So it gets, and this is why the human immune system is such an incredibly complex system, because it has all these layers of the organs, and then within that there are sub-functions, and there are cells, and within the cells, and so it's very, very, very deeply layered, which makes it super complex.
When you say that, so it's a simplification, but even for the agents that follow simple rules, do you think that includes like the variance that the agents have? Like, does that include the scenario, like we listed the 3 examples for the birds?
Yeah.
Does that include a 4th option where just a bird just does whatever sort of the bird is hungry? Just any sort of random variance?
Yeah. Yeah, and this is the free will thing. You can, there's no, the rules, you can have a system where, again, I think this is, I'm sorry to pick on you except when you use your phone, which I would ask you not to do.
Oh, sorry.
But I do commend you for, because this is a really good example, right? When somebody decides not to follow the rules, that's part of a complex system, and it influences the outcome.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is if we play it again, maybe a few others would say, well, I'm sick, I don't want to do this either. And really, maybe it's contagious and more people step out.
Yeah.
So that can all be part of it, right? It's not, the examples that I've shown you with these cars and these birds are kind of simplified because they all neatly follow the rules, but the reality is much messier.
And you think it is, when we talk about complex adaptive systems, you think the default assumption is that we are taking that into account?
Yeah, typically, again, as you've seen in this little example, it's not significant to the collective behavior, right? A number of agents can go off the reservation, and it still doesn't change the
Overall.
yeah. The same thing in traffic, right? If somebody decides to stop by the side of the road and take a nap, it doesn't influence the traffic pattern.
Seen as an outlier, not.
Yeah, they don't. And so is the complex system, the technical terms are quite resilient in many ways to abnormal behavior. Is that this emergent property tends to be quite resilient to things breaking, etc., which is one of the reasons nature invented this way of organizing, because you want something that's reliable even. So your immune system is the same. All sorts of things can break, and it still delivers the service of providing immunity for you.
Fault tolerant.
Yeah, so this resilience or fault tolerance is very essential to complex systems. In fact, non-complex systems, so complicated systems, have no resilience, 0. And so if you're looking for these fault tolerance, resilient properties, you actually need to have a complex system. So it's one of the essential properties. So if you think also about organizations, right, it makes a huge difference whether you think of an organization like that or the usual way where it's described, you have a CEO or a director at the top and the people, et cetera, which is a very different way of framing it. And there's a famous example by a guy called Barabasi, who's one of the most famous complexity scientists. who of course is Hungarian, and of course he emigrated to the US to do serious work. And but then he was called back by a Hungarian company at some point, who said, could you help us understand, you know, our company doesn't seem to work very well, people don't understand our strategy. Some of you who've worked in organizations may know this is the classic complaint of every manager is, they don't understand our strategy. And so they had this question, and so Barabasi came back to this Hungarian company, and what he asked them is for a dump of all the email traffic inside of the company, and he created a map of the network of email traffic and filtered out all the news bulletins and all the crap, etc. And he was able to see that there were 4 nodes in the system that were actually essential information nodes, where a lot of the information went out of. None of them were senior managers, none of the 4. And one of them was the safety manager, who was a wonderful guy, very extrovert, who went around the company sites all around the country to do safety testing, but he was always telling the stories about the other sites, and you know, this kind of personality, right? And so he turned out to be an incredibly crucial connector inside of this company. And also the others, and none of the managers actually played this role. So they had this vision of a company that was organized as a hierarchy, but if you looked at it through a complex systems lens, you noticed that actually the big nodes were completely different and disjunct from the management. Solution was incredibly simple. Invite those 4 people once a month to the board and actually learn and use them as dissemination agents, and that solved the problem. But it's so also, you know, thinking of a company, so we represent all these things as complicated systems, like a company, like this hierarchy, but actually it's largely a complex system. And the way you do all these things, managing, budgeting, compensation, the very idea of bonuses, for example, variable pay is kind of a classic reductionist idea that, you know, if you give people more money, they'll do something. There is 0 evidence that that's the case. There's a really wonderful Harvard Business Review paper called Why Financial Incentives Don't Work. There's no evidence in any serious psychology research that bonuses are anything but counterproductive. And yet, they're everywhere, right? And routinely, the press writes about, oh, this person got a bonus because he or she did something great. And we know, if you think about thing as a complex system, you understand why bonuses can't work. But so we've got all these things in the world that are we sort of take for granted that actually are based on a particular way of framing a system. You look worried. No? You're not going to get a bonus. Anyway, so this is you know, again, this is the core image. I would, you know, if you retain anything from this morning, I think it's this picture and this idea of emergent properties. And this is where, you know, this coin drop moment is the moment, and you may already be there, but somewhere into the course of the year, you're going to say, okay, now I really understand what these emergent properties are. And you may already, right? Or you may wake up one morning and think, oh, yeah. Because it's a weird, and then there's plenty more to learn, but it's a weird concept. So the birds. So this is the bird simulation. So the 3 things, the 3 rules are separation. They need to steer to avoid the crowding local flock mates, basically don't run into each other. Alignment, steer towards the average heading of local flock mates. And cohesion, steer to move towards the average position of local flock mates. I mean, you know, this is fairly technical, but if you want to program it, these are the rules you need. But you know, the thing to remember, you know, in a sense, is trivial and only matters to bird flocking. And if you want to use drones to reproduce flocking, you would need these rules as well. But the true insight is, wow, you know, they don't need any collective consciousness, they only need local consciousness, they don't need any emotion, they don't need any ideology, they don't need any consciousness, and yet they can do this amazing collective behavior. So just a couple of basic concepts that I've touched upon is the prevailing approach, which is referred to as reductionism or positivism. I mean, it comes in different guises, has three basic premises. One is the division between subject and object. This is, this is what we're educated with, is you divide these. Causality is that one action leads to a particular result. And reductionism is that the whole this is basically the whole is the sum of the parts. And in complex systems, all three of these are not true. So there's an interconnection between subject and object, which you also find in quantum mechanics, for example, for the fine tasters. Causality is a much more difficult thing. I've just lost my bag at some point, but oh, it's over there. I'm just reading, if you're interested, an absolutely fascinating book called The Book of Why, which, apart from being a title, talks about causality and how we understand that. And so, but in a complex systems, because of the braiding, right, the plexus, there's an interconnection between the subject. They depend on each other. Causality is a little bit messy, right? What's the cause of the emergent property? It's hard to articulate in the terms we're used to. And the emergent property is more than the sum of the parts. It's something that's been created collectively that you can't attribute to the individual bits. And so these three things are the basis of, essentially largely Western, by the way, the Western scientific approach for the past 250 years. This is basically has come about at the end of the 18th century, more or less. This way of framing the world. And so you have 250 years of education in these three bits, and complexity basically breaks with all three.
Complexity breaks all three?
Yes.
So these are the concepts that are used in positivism. I don't understand where the word positivism comes from.
So positivism is a philosophical streaming, but does reductionism work better for you?
Okay, we as well. I'm not sure how this relates to
I
complexity.
will explain it in one of the research classes. And then I can relate it to this.
Okay.
I mean, it's basically the name of a philosophical stream, but forget the word positivism. These are kind of, if you think about cooking, right? The intellectual recipe that we've created in the 18th century, which has lasted 250 years, says all of your science is built on these three critical ingredients. Whenever you're and science in a big sense, right? Also when you're trying to solve a management problem, etc. We assume there's direct causality. We assume that subject and object are separate. So I'm the one finding the solution, and my finding the solution doesn't influence the problem. They're not interacting.
That's the assumption.
Yeah, those are the assumptions. They're huge assumptions that were made largely, I mean, it's a simplification, largely 250 years ago, and that our entire education system and our universities and our way of looking at the world, basically these three things underpin a lot of how you approach the world. They don't underpin, I think you asked me, what the feeling was in accessing one of those Mundermann squares, so spaces, shared spaces. They don't underpin our humanity, right? Is if, when you organize a party and the party is successful, you assume none of these things. Nobody believes a party is equivalent to the invitees, the booze, and the music. Nobody assumes that people are independent, and nobody assumes that there's some sort of direct causality. In our social, our intuitive, and our emotional lives, we completely understand complexity. it's hugely familiar and actually feels better, which is why these shared spaces, actually you feel more human when you're navigating them than if you're following rules that somebody else set up for you. So as human beings, we ourselves are complex systems, and our humanity and our emotions are incredibly connected to all of that. But we've had a rational education that is built on these assumptions. And what complexity offers is actually, I think that's why it's so exciting, is a rational, scientific view of the world that's in harmony with our humanity, which I think is great, actually, quite exciting. Exciting idea. Sorry, I don't want to expand too much into philosophy, but I think your question is quite pertinent to that. Okay. Just a little bit of history, because you'll come across these words. There's all sorts of stuff out there, right? There's systems theory. There's this thing about design thinking. There was artificial life, social networks, chaos theory, fractals, autopoiesis. You may come across. There's this Chilean thing. Some wonderful people. Non-equilibrium thermodynamics. Epistemic game theory. There's all this kind of stuff out there over the past, 50 or 100 years. And apart from the Y that's dropped here, that is basically flowing into this umbrella of complexity science. And it doesn't mean that all those things are wrong or don't exist, is that they came about in different bits, and it's starting to consolidate itself under the name of complexity. But some people, say, no, I just do systems theory. I don't do complexity. And again, the words are whatever they want, but whatever you want them to mean. I think it's an easy way to think of all these things that deal with complex systems as an umbrella discipline of complexity. So I view design thinking and all that as kind of a tool that comes under complexity, but there are all sorts of design folks who say, no, that's the real thing, and complexity is just this technical thing. I'm not particularly worried about it, but it's useful to know that there's no particular contradiction between all these things. It's a little bit of a horse race. Is that fair? Okay. So, one last example before we do a little bit of group work and then we conclude. Who designed the modern bicycle? Who's the inventor of the bicycle?
Probably the Dutch.
Collectively? So it's an emergent phenomenon of the culture.
Could be.
I guess people like hundreds of years ago, and we're just modifying the cars.
Very good. That's the right answer. There is no inventor of the modern bicycle, and there's a beautiful book, if you're interested in innovation, by somebody called Brian Arthur, who was one of the main complexity scientists, called The Nature of Technology. And he argues is there are no inventors of anything. Our concept of inventors actually is a mistake. So what happened with bicycles is that people, indeed, at the end of the 19th century, invented all these different types of vehicles. You all know the thing with the huge wheel and the small wheel in the back. And there was the thing that you walked. And there were all sorts of different. And so what people did is then it evolved through deductive tinkering. So this is kind of innovation sex in a sense, is that these systems mixed and exchanged DNA and recombined in a different way to create the next generation of inventions. And it evolved to the modern design over a relatively short period. It's about 30 years at the end of the 19th century, and from here to there. And actually very little changed. The current bicycles we have is pretty much the same design as 1890. I mean, there's a carbon fiber thing, and there's the occasional, but they're tweaks. I mean, the fundamental model And this is what Brian Arthur also describes as the essential source of innovation. So it's a biological model of innovation. Is that what you have is you have multiple species in an ecosystem who interact with each other and take ideas and recombine in a new way, in a better way. And so it's kind of an evolution. And typically what happens is that the inventor is the person who at the end of the chain says, I got it! But actually, have they really invented the thing, or they've just sort of nailed the last stage in the evolution process? It's a bit like if we would say, we've invented mankind, man in the sense of man and woman. That also would be silly. Simply because we're here, we can't claim to have invented ourselves. And so the idea of inventor is in many ways also a reductionist concept. Because if you think of innovation as this recombination of ideas over a particular time, then you get a very different sense of, who are the heroes in this process, right? It's really quite unclear. So what I would suggest, is that clear? Is this story? And this is true for everything, right? Brian Arthur in this book, it's a delightful, it's a really thin, my own book's thicker and harder to read, but this book is I found it really exciting because I remember reading and thinking, oh, is that how it works? Because it literally, he says, he starts the book by saying he's been looking into innovation. He said, I haven't found any serious thinker who explains how innovation works. So he wrote this thin little book, which then I think when you've read it, you think, okay, that's how innovation works. And his claim is there are no inventors, there really aren't, and there are no new ideas, none. What we qualify as a new idea is a recombination of existing ideas all the way. I mean, there may be some tiny exceptions. And as a last story, and then apologies for all these, Einstein is always credited as one of the great, relativity theory is the great invention. And he came up with relativity theory in 1905. And Einstein had trouble getting a job because nobody would employ him. So he found a job. He wanted to do science, but he couldn't find a job, and he was employed at the patent office in Bern. And he was bored to death because he wanted to develop physics, and he had to look at patent applications all day. And in the year 1904, which is the year before he so-called invented relativity theory, the Swiss were obsessed about many things, but in particular they were obsessed with synchronizing clocks between cantons and valleys. So there were in this year, there were 120 patent applications for clock synchronization between churches and valleys, and how do you get clocks synchronized all of Switzerland so that all of Switzerland would be in the same clock pole. And what Einstein did is, because he was bored, he said, okay, well, he was just playing around. What if we put these clocks, instead of in towers, we put them in trains in different valleys and move them around? How would that influence the clock? And then, well, what if we put it on a train and accelerate it to the end of the universe and maybe have it run at the speed of light? And so he was building on these ideas, all these different ideas on clock synchronization, and adding the bits of theoretical physics that he knew about and recombine this into relativity theory. But if he had not been employed by the patent office and had to review 100 patents on clocks, he would not have come up with relativity theory. It was a recombination. And here you're just recombining bicycles. In true innovation, you're recombining things that are not obvious and are disconnected from each other. So yeah.
Can you say again the name of the book?
The nature of innovation. The nature of technology. The nature of technology. It's Brian Arthur. And Brian Arthur is an economist. He was one of the founders of the Santa Fe Institute. He's a delightful man. I know him very, very gentle, nice person too. So, can feel good about the office. So what I would like you to do is get into little groups of maybe 3 is a good group. Yes, no, well, 2 or 3 and 1 or 4. And maybe for 20 minutes or 25 minutes, look at a problem through a complexity lens, right? And my argument, I think, all morning, hopefully, is that when you look through this lens, you see something different than if you look through the reductionist lens that we've all been educated with, which is direct causality, separate object and subject, and the whole is equal to the sum of the parts. And what it suggests is, so get into groups of 3. I don't know what it says, find. Identify a topic. Now you could take innovation, for example, you just talked about that, but there may be some other topic that you care about, organizing a company or whatever. But innovation's a pretty good one. And try to describe what interventions, so if you take innovation, and for example, you're the head of innovation of a company, you're the head of science for a country or something, what policies and actions would you take to get more innovation through a complexity lens or through a reductionist lens? What different measures would you take if you used one approach or the other approach? And not, I don't need 20 things, right? If you have 2 good examples, in a reductionist lens, you would do this. Like think traffic, right? If you, instead of innovation, you pick traffic, which I hope you don't, because that's too simple. Through a reductionist lens, you would put in lots of rules, as we have today, and through a complexity lens, you would go the Monderman route and basically self-organize, but you would have to test whether you've got the culture and the context for it, and you'd also have to figure out whether it works for the long term. So there are still questions. But I think traffic we may have exhausted. So I would suggest innovation, but you may have another topic that you worked on or that you care about. So pick that quickly. Don't spend 20 minutes talking about which topic are we going to pick, because it doesn't matter that much. And try to come up with 1 or 2 interventions in these 2 different ways of framing the question. I'll come around to your groups and chat. Is that clear? Clear enough?
Fair enough. How much
Okay.
time do you have?
I'd say, shall we take 20 minutes so that we've got a good half hour to get questions and have a last conversation on some of these things? Is that okay?
Shall we do a cup of coffee?
Yeah, quickly, because most of them don't always have the background, so they have the basis. So I have a class about different communities. So to position where they are is making minutes. Also because they have to be able to kind of assess, what they're going to put out to compare. Yes, I know. Yeah. No, but sometimes you have to, you have to explain something to position the imagineering ideal approach, within the wider body of knowledge that exists. It's not really, I don't really dig into the philosophy behind it, but just But if they run into the positivist, that they at least have a certain understanding.
I'm not sure what to take, but go back to the 18th century philosophers.
I mean, some battles they are educated,
Which in essence
Yeah, so it feels like, oh,
the
but
main
it
tool
safer. So we have more
allows
buses.
you
Sorry.
for agents involved.
Yeah, adding technology, so it's still very vague, you know, just adding, or like, yeah, you could think
Has an enormous library that try to take bird flocking. You could be able to change bird flocking rules.
yeah, just like there's a sign, someone walks by, like,
In a whole year program, it's actually worth probably a couple of days. It helps tune your nature because you can try these things. Okay, if I change these rules, can I predict what's going to happen? And inevitably you think, no, and then you do it and say, okay, I could have known. And you sort of recognize your own cognitive dissonance. Which is considered hindsight.
because what he said earlier about the never understand from the standpoint, some people always understand as shocking. Our students never fully understand the they always focus on one aspect by
Die vogels die hebben geen individueel bewustzijn van zijn werk. En toch doen die het. En eigenlijk is dat ook
Just the same. Just the same.
En of de mensen individueel bewust zijn, daarna wordt het ingewikkeld, maar het punt is, in die lesje vanochtend, is een onderscheid te maken. Als je het geheel wil beïnvloeden, dat je dan ook alle agenten zo ziet beïnvloeden. Je wil het in agenten. En wat is daarvoor nodig? Moet je daar alles in de wacht of kun je net als onderman iets doen aan het ecosysteem, waar de mensen net zo onbedullig bekrompen zijn als ze altijd al waren. Wat moet ik doen aan de individuele vogels? En ja,
allemaal different bedragen, de ouders dingen dingen.
Collectief duurzaam gedrag eigenlijk.
Ja, ik zie een focus van mij
Maar dit is de uitdaging, dus kan ik iets verzinnen.
ja,
Ja, ja.
en net als met embrace the self, iedereen knows to embrace this. I don't get the embrace proposition, I don't get them yet, but I think embraced. Disruption, you know, disruption for the system to change, to it, so principles.
Is er een manier om het geheel te Nee, dit is echt substantieel lastig. Dit is
So our goal is innovating with smart cities and not having safer environment. So we say something.
I don't write those two things down. We never
We want to innovate the city in a smart way, a complex way.
dat je er ook wel gaat nadenken dan zou je iets meer zijn en dit soort gedragingen.
No topic. We want to talk about that topic not in a reductionist way, but in a complex way.
De trigger te zijn voor andere gedragen.
So our reductionist approach, we want to innovate by weight sensitive design, and an effect of that is that it saves electricity. Another innovation is also reductionist is very
ja, zijn denk ik wel
En dat is echt
levens.
yeah, and we only as I say, so really do the
Aanhouden dat
Terwijl
ja.
exactly. So what if we got our topic
Toen moesten we zelf opnemen in plaats van dat het scheidsrechter sloot. Het ging veel beter. We waren allemaal super eerlijk tegen elkaar als team. Ja. Dan moet je nou meteen denken, iedereen is een andere leuke wedstrijd. Iemand
test op alle wegen, ja.
lots of our computers that they look smart
Maar daar was het zo uit.
and others kind of
Ja, precies.
the question was whether smart cities are really yet you know when you have actually so what you see in these contexts because somebody better bicycle than that one.
wel moeten komen. En zo wel ja.
Staat het?
Complexity, you see what the students do in the proposal, low level, simplistic and all that. Yeah, I did my thing. I also thought who's one teaching. But then I also thought through complexities,
And the challenge with all these policy questions like this, the challenge with all these sustainability, you're actually trying to change the emergent property.
that's peace.
And how do you do that without changing all the individual agents? Is there something you can change to the rules of the ecosystem so that you have different emergent property as opposed to go after the
I always say, also,
the challenge. It's not easy, but it's not that easy.
But there's also a reason why one point I said, let's get rid of the standard complexity sentences paper, because it doesn't make any sense. I feel it comes with Diana, but there is no problem to it, so let's put it out and let's make a conscious choice. So these are all the tools we give you your thoughts. You start with students here, now it's your project. So in that sense, I think the only broke a little bit with that traditional role system.
That they're actually more interesting solutions than non-transport. If you have that are collecting
Maybe it is.
Well, it's only good delivery. And I know that it's growing.
Yeah, but on the other hand, if I look at the students lost from the future, with their interactions with their industry, they were very strong and convincing, even without mentioning the complexity, the self-necessary complexity.
So you have an opportunity to redesign the entire energy industry.
It was, no, it was very
Social norms,
military
because
approach, they were very, even more articulated in our explaining. Yeah, and that's all we are.
the social norms around consumerism is not
Because we don't want
driverless cars are a fascinating intervention in the city for non-transport reasons. For transport reasons, that's kind of reason. And so that's, in a sense, it's kind of a catalytic event because you change all sorts of other things through this one intervention.
Yeah, but I think triggers are well saying, but we do it in the engineering way. It's this history that we show, and you recommend this because everybody does the same. Most of it gets explained because they do it their own way. No, we should. I think it's time now to make a discussion.
Yeah, you generally have to take hypotheses based on experience. But for most of innovation, and if there are also correlations, if you took this idea of the driverless car, then you say, well, that's very interesting.
We should like
Yeah, maybe even though the research and the data says you don't have to explicitly explain it anymore, these are basic principles. I don't know.
If you get to redesign 30% of the space in your city,
You can publish that. If you publish about that, you can publish about it. I want to publish about syllabus.
it's not like a one-man
Otherwise, no, I don't have
structure of intervention because you're trying to find something that will have a knock-on effect
to get it better, it's just to explain.
It's different than saying we have the ability to insert
Some things are, if you look at the body, if you have it.
Yeah, of don't, there are tricks. Because you always have to do something. So you cannot just do what others do, you have to give it your own twist.
Yeah.
Those people who we do it a little bit differently, and this is so I don't agree, okay, if you frame it as an interview, people will know, but if you don't, you do that more subtle. Start publishing,
Yeah.
creating your own.
But I think it's easier if you leave
Which in a sense, in a crude way, is what it
because
Or subtle.
and link to
I think that's a good message.
but while it's all different
I don't know.
works, you learn about
Well, it depends on the curious. If you're on publishing pressure, publish that many papers,
agents, destinations, the basics are pretty straightforward.
Into that direction. But then,
You didn't think what's going on.
it's difficult to wed a practitioner. Register.
I don't because I don't meet the roots, this exercise. She stopped, I still have a form. You made a review to look for I don't say you have to have the high ranked ICI first, and they're all positives. But there are a lot of journals, with embraced this.
Or medical or
Or
with the innovation
I
is
had two approaches. I looked at friends of the example Danielle Sunday, because she's important to them, so it relates to Danielle Sunday. So I looked where does she publish. And we had another approach. Social innovation,
daar hebben ze geen innovations within healthcare.
Yeah, yes.
Healthcare.
Yeah, yes. And we came up with three you're
Ja, dat was het.
then how difficult the process was. And I decided not to be a co-writer so that I don't have so what I'm doing it. So I said I just want to go through this process because I learned from the process as well. So now it's stopped and I stopped. But I think I would love this is something I see for the future. Yeah, so now my job but I think this is the way to go. And also it went quite smoothly, but then we still have to do the work of writing an article that you actually can send in reviews. And that's not coming from place from the paper. And if we then commit ourselves as co-writers, then I think we should have also hours to do that, because in the end the work will be out.
Ik vind dat ik lees ook de mensen complexity. Ik ga ook niet zo voor aflevering. Het is zo creative. Dat op een gegeven moment wil je daar ook iets mee.
So I question if you go for complexity, you go for the complexity. Nee,
No, but
no.
that's not so
because then you have to join them. And you find them who are not, you see some differences. And you see, for example, how Sura does choose more and more stakeholders. This is what now the original founder, of this work is putting letters saying everybody now has their own definition. This is why I mentioned, but it's allowed, and if you fine, everybody can go their own. So, and if we say we are complexity, so then we get never publish.
No, because
Yeah, exactly, because you don't need that. If you are,
maar ik dacht misschien wel eens, hoe kan je dat
let's see if we still have.
Ja.
Oh yeah, this was my.
Ja, alle lucht uit.
Ik dacht echt.
Oh, die! Ja, meneer CO2-uitstoot in de professional mini. And then at least have something out there. And then that was already great for us. Hebben die als je kijkt, ja, dan heb je deze meteen. Maar ik eet sowieso maar zo weinig vlees. Ja, ik kan. Ja, oh, you want to do more scientific
So I said we discussed
It's a combination
yeah,
theory
and I
and
said theoretically you don't have that much time. So really from a practical point of view, perfect one to in afternoon, so you look a little bit. But I see these strategies to publish as possible next year. I'm not saying we are complexity or social no, we are social inventions or social innovations. So I was really charmed. Maybe we can even like have a membership. Yes.
Eigenlijk vlees eten en ja, maar ik dan vlees eten. Nu kijkt degene die ook opties heeft, en dan
We're opening up for all these guidelines. You don't go. You can go, but it's not how it works. Right?
Hoe gaan mensen dat zelf quizzes aanzetten? Wordt dit best interessant om te refusers?
And there was another one that I found, which I think that was also a contender.
Right, I think we reconvene. We just reconvene for a second, or for a half hour to be precise.
I was looking at that.
Ladies?
Sorry, for us, interesting. I was looking
Okay. This is a bit like taking a yoga class where I'm the only man in the room.
Yeah.
So, shall we just hear very briefly from every group, what problem you had, and very quickly the reductionist and the complexity solution. Do you want to start?
So we had stuff with sustainability, but focusing on litter, and from the reductionist view, it would be a solution by giving fines to people who litter. So actually focusing on the individual, and then we were trying to get a solution based on the complexity view. So we thought of just getting rid of all the litter rules, so no garbage trucks, no bins, so that people are responsible for their own litter, and then we hope that they find a way to take care of their own litter because they feel responsible for it, so that it kind of gets recycled into one household instead of the municipality or the country being responsible for this, so that people feel responsible for themselves.
And also, we hope that if you're responsible for your own litter, that you won't buy all the packaging with all the extra packaging that you don't need, so that you make wise choices because you don't want that all in your house.
Yeah, and the danger, of course, is that you end up with a lot of litter because people throw it out anyway, right? I have somebody I know at the University of Groningen who runs a particular perverse experiment on this topic. He's a complexity social scientist, and what he does is he put some nonsensical ad on student bicycles, a place where with an elastic, these advertisement things for something you really don't care about. So that people want to throw it away immediately, and then they have waste paper baskets in the street. And they run multiple experiments increasing the distance between the baskets, but also increasing whether there are papers on the floor around the baskets or whether it's all inside. So those are the variables, right? Is everything clean inside the basket, and what's the distance between the waste paper baskets? To understand the parameters of the model, right? Should you get rid of all waste paper baskets? Or is there an optimal distance that makes people more responsible? So I think you had the right thought that you can actually go further and experiment this kind of stuff. And the thing they came up with is some metrics around how people behave in littering. And one of the things they discovered, for example, is that how much is on the street makes a huge difference. If there are only a few on the street around the waste paper basket, people will chuck it easily. And if it's all in the waste paper baskets, even if they're fairly distant, people will walk a long way to put it in the basket. And so some of the policy consequences of that is, one of the cheapest way to clean a city is to run the cleanup crews at night because there's no traffic. But actually, if people see streets being cleaned, they will have less. They will litter less. So you have an interesting trade-off between the cost of cleaning the street and the amount of litter that's there. Because if you clean it, so the question becomes: should I clean every night and once a week visibly, or do I need to do it twice a week visibly? And so you get this kind of. You can see how you can. I think in the dimensions you've painted, how you can fine-tune and say, okay, what's the optimum to change the emergent behavior of the system? And you run experiments, you can do all sorts of things. Yeah, those are the dimensions for this kind of stuff. Great.
Yeah, so we showed the topic of smart cities, and then generally we're saying how to make a city better. Our reductionist approaches were to only turn lights on at night if there were people on the sidewalks, so we have weight sensors or motion sensors, so turn lights on when people are nearby. And then also only allowing self-driving vehicles into the city, say that if everything's automated, it will probably be safer, we'll have less people needing to staff the positions. And then as a complex approach, we were brainstorming, and we came up with a similar idea. Here's the same. Just for generally making the city better, we thought, what would happen if we got rid of trash cans? And I've spent some time in Tokyo, and they really do not have trash cans in the city. It's very hard to find a trash can, and yet pristine, beautiful streets everywhere. So we came up with the similar ideas that people are more likely to be responsible maybe for their trash, or they would buy less to start with, you would see less waste packaging. We were also thinking that if it was combined with the ideas of only letting certain vehicles within the city, it would probably change how waste management was done entirely in terms of people bringing out their trash or a truck to pick it up. It might be done also through a more automated system or scheduled differently, which would also have different implications. It could be privatized and there would be different competition.
Yeah.
And we also hope that packaging design would be designed in a way that it would have less packaging, so that there would be less packaging in the row altogether.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it also points to the fact that we had a little bit of a discussion with the group is when you think about these problems, you also have to consider the problem statement, right? Is that, you know, smart cities is a weird concept. Right? It's not very well, nobody quite knows what it means, and you know, it was started as an idea, a marketing thing. And the same is true for sustainability, by the way. It's also a not very well defined concept. So you know, reducing waste in the street is a good problem because you actually know when you have more or less of it, and you can tackle it. But many of these things that, you know, like smart cities and sustainability are really quite messy. They're either marketing or political ideas, which matter in the world, but to solve a problem around those is difficult because they're so ill-defined. And then your discussion ends up being wishy-washy because you don't have a really well-defined problem. So always be careful when you look at these complex systems is that you've got something that's defined enough that you know when it works or doesn't. And it doesn't mean that sustainability doesn't matter, but you know, when you have more or less of it, it's a really messy subject. Also a smart city.
Yeah, so we use a problem of coming up with the best tents for a refugee camp, and the reduction as a startup. And our reduction approach was at first, well, we identify the needs of what can be done better, and then we come up with the tent, which is like the best possible tent ever for a refugee camp. And then we'll just say, yeah, we got a product, let's put it in there, and that must function because we got a careful analysis of the market. And then we got a complex approach, and because basically we started, or we need to fit into the system that is already existing there, because there are governmental restrictions, there are other companies producing the same tents. So the essential thing there to do would be come up with different designs of different tents, for like 20 or 10 different designs, and then try to insert them at the same time, and then see the reactions of the government, see the reactions of refugees themselves, the reactions of other companies, and then we'll pick the best one.
Yeah, maybe like gradually have it like the five, or to combine like the best aspect of each tent, and then try another prototyping, and then like assessing it again and again, so we can get like the design for the time.
So we'll get the design at the end by from my evolution approach. So it's like, yeah, this tent was great, but it was not fireproof. This tent was not so good, but the color didn't match the governmental regulations. And at the end, we created a narrative tent, which is the best out of them all.
Yeah, super. So it's very much like the bicycle store. It's essentially an evolutionary or survival of the fittest in a sense. Recombine until you get a better. And as you may or may not know, and I gave them this example, is that many of the large software companies like Booking.com or Amazon, etc., do that when they want to introduce a modification to their user interface. They come up with 10 different variations, they implement each of them for 10,000 users, and they see how users react. And based on that, they may tweak it further. So they realize that there's no way that they can invent their way to an improvement of their interface. The only way is to have multiple variations and see what works and recombine from there. Now, it doesn't mean you start with a whole bunch of completely random ideas, but it's this evolutionary way of design. And in fact, let me give you an example of that. Which is this story. So this is ID Lab is one of those Silicon California outfits that looks at innovation. And they had a really interesting question. If you look at solar energy, there are two kinds of solar energy, as you may know, right? You have solar PV, photovoltaic, the classic solar panels, which is another Einstein invention, or non-invention, which basically takes sunlight and converts it to electricity. But you also have these mirror things where you reflect the sunlight to a point, and you create the heat to boil water, and with that you run a turbine. Right? So this is another way. And so the problem with these solar things is that you actually have to direct them to the sun. And you have these solar concentrators, which have a big engine and a laser and so it needs to turn constantly to keep facing the sun, which is quite an expensive thing. And if you build them in the desert, for example, in Morocco is now building the largest of these solar farms in the world. You have literally thousands of mirrors in the desert that reflect the sunlight into a single point with these huge heat, and based on that you create power. But they typically don't turn the mirrors because in the desert or outside these engines break, and so it's a very expensive way of doing it. So these people asked a bunch of designers, what's the best shape that I can think of that's static, that would reflect the sunlight optimally without this kind of engine? And the way they went about it is through exactly this kind of genetic thing, is they did it in a computer, and they started with a random shape, and literally random. They took, just a potato or any kind of shape, and then shined light on it. And then, of course, in the computer, you can see how much of it is reflected to a single point. And they took the bits of it that reflected best and threw away the rest, recombined those, and so that created a new shape. And they did, through 10,000 evolutions, you could see how the shape would grow in the computer to get the shape that optimizes, that reflects best. Do you understand how it works? So it's the same as the bicycle or your tent design, etc. And I asked Marcel Wonders, who some of you may know is a rather famous Dutch designer. I told him this story once, and he said, "Oh, but it's very easy. Designers can do this much better." I said, "Okay, draw me the best shape for." He's a guy with a big ego. And so he drew some pathetic banana-shaped thing on a piece of paper. And the interesting thing is the shape that comes out of this is this. Now, what does that remind you of?
A flower.
Because nature has solved the same problem, right? And in the very same way. And so this is quite, and obviously, the exact mathematical shape is different than a flower, etc. But you could see that with this kind of, it's called genetic algorithm, genetic design, you sort of get close to the essence of how nature does design. And that is actually both the most efficient and so whether you do tents through this evolution or bicycles or sorts of other things, this is kind of a cool example of how you get to something that, and then they modified it, I don't know, for some bizarre reason into something else, but the process is fundamentally that. And this is now also used, for example, by pharmaceutical companies. It's called something called algorithmic chemistry, which they abbreviate to alchemy, which is rather cute. And so in order to design a new drug, for example, or a new antibiotic, they generate, 1 million different molecules through they can do this these days. They put that into a vat with the bacteria you're trying to kill, and then they figure out which molecules seem to be most effective. They filter those out, they analyze which ones they are, they recombine their features, and they do this over a whole bunch of cycles, and that in the end generates a new antibiotic, which is a completely different way of designing than saying, okay, you know, I need to figure out the bacteria, you know, what hooks does it have, how do I kill it, which can also work, right? It's not that one's bad and one's good, but it's just a completely different way of operating and of taking a design approach. And it's rooted in these ideas of self-organization. So it's quite a bridge, right, from this to our little simulation in the beginning. But I hope you can sort of glimpse that it, in a sense, it's all the same principles of having simple rules to recombine things that lead to a different kind of emergent behavior. Yeah, there's this little Dilbert cartoon. So in response to your continuous harping about not having enough funding, I hired an expensive consultant to analyze your budget. I'll have to run some chaos and complexity simulations, but it looks as if you need more money. You know, complexity is not a religion or anything, right? It's not that everything in the world is complex, and there are things that are non-complex, and don't worry, reductionist approach are great. But the skill is to determine, you know, when do I have a complex problem, and do I need complexity solutions and tools, and when do I not? And if you mix them, you get suboptimal results in both cases. And so that, in a sense, is the skill. And there are plenty of things where, and this is the reason our world is, you know, the reason for a lot of human development is that there's lots of things that work well in reductionist fashion. But you could argue that the current problems of biodiversity loss and climate change, etc., are a side effect of using that reductionist approach to solve all sorts of part problems, and we've lost track of the whole. So none of this is completely without any cost. I just wanted to give you two more examples as the last thing, but unless, you know, if you want to come back to anything I've said before, feel free about that. I can give you two more stories, if you like that. Right, so feel free to interrupt if there's anything you say, well, actually, there's something I didn't understand from before, this is the time to come back to that. If not, I can entertain two more stories.
The challenge is in applying it.
Yeah.
Applying it yourself. But I guess we'll get to do it a lot in our research.
That's the idea.
Yes.
So let me give you two more stories and examples. One is about obesity. There is an obesity epidemic, clearly not in this room, but out there, which is extremely serious, right? It's an enormous health problem. And the usual reductionist answer is that, you know, people are obese because they eat too much and don't exercise enough. So, you know, what you do, so what are the typical solutions? Well, or tax sugar, right? You know, take Coca-Cola out of schools, and create exercise programs, and give people financial free fitness membership, you know, all this kind of, you know, we've got so the emergent problem is that, you know, there are many people who are overweight. Or is it, there's a whole bunch of individuals who are overweight. So the complexity framing is there's a collective problem, and the reductionist framing is a bunch of fat people who need to fix that, which is a different way of framing it. Now it turns out, and a number of complexity scientists have looked at that, is if you know somebody who knows somebody who's overweight, you are more likely to gain weight. And the reason is obesity is completely an epidemic. So it's contagious, and it's contagious quite far into social networks. And this is quantitatively, there's no doubt. I mean, there's a massive database, and you can look at like any epidemic, the speed of spread or the super spread, it has all the same characteristics as an epidemic. And the reason, of course, it's not a virus or anything. This is, you sit in a restaurant with a bunch of friends and you say, shall we order dessert? And somebody said, oh, come on, don't be a spoiled for it, let's order some dessert. So it's these little social things that spread across networks. And this is a relatively recent insight from the past decade or so. And there are a number of countries, and particularly the UK, that have sort of completely changed their policy towards obesity. And the city of Amsterdam, actually an institute where I'm working, we had a big session with the mayor last week actually about this. And they're completely changing their public health approach by looking at this as a social and as a contagion problem as opposed to as a problem of an individual. And that changes completely the policy measures that you take, because if you're dealing with an epidemic, you want to look at what are the sources of contagion and of spreading, and how do I deal with those, as opposed to try to fix the weight of every individual. So this is another one of those examples. Is if you look at it as a complex problem or as a non-complex problem, you come up with different interventions, and so it's not the same. It's not a little bit of a tweak. It's a radically different way of tackling a problem. And it could be difficult, right? Because if you understand that this is contagious, then do you make it illegal for teachers to be overweight? Because they're a bad example. I don't know. It's not what I'm advocating, but you could see that you get to some uncomfortable, you get to different, and maybe you say, well, that's socially, we can't do that, and you don't. But you do explore, so it's a very different thing than just taxing sugar or something. So a very, it's an interesting story, and you may pick up in blogs or newspapers because it's really starting to change. So it's one of the major Western, or no, actually global health issues. And so in the past decade, because of this complexity approach, people are completely reframing the way it's being tackled, which is really fascinating. It's just measures that you wouldn't have taken before. Then as a last example, I promised to do, with your Rabobank thing, I promised I'd say something about bankers. There's a really interesting story, this is one of my favorite complexity stories. With the 2008 financial crisis happened now a decade ago. Since then, banks have been fined a total of $300 billion for all sorts of crimes they've committed. $300 billion, right? It's one after the, if you pick up newspapers, routinely there's another bank who gets a $4 billion fine and a $5 billion. It goes on and on and on. And this is criminal behavior, right? This isn't just sort of little transgressions. It's major criminal behavior. And so at some point, there were some social scientists who said, well, what's the problem with this industry? Are bankers more criminal than average people? Right? Which is a reasonable question. If you've got an industry where there's a massive amount of criminality, then you could think there are more criminals. And this is where it turns out that actually it's the emergent property of banking that's more criminal, but the individuals are not. Which is and the way they ran an experiment to discover. Apologies if any of your next of kin are bankers, but this is a serious story will help. So what they did is they ran an experiment. They asked 300 bankers, I think, to collaborate, and they put them in a room where they had to flip a coin, and they were given $1 if it was head and nothing if it was tails, and they had to do it like 50 times or something. So one thing it tells you that bankers aren't great statisticians, because the answer is pretty clearly that you'd end up with half right, because it's always 50% chance. But people self-reported whether they had head or tails. And they ran this experiment with 300 bankers and also 300 non-bankers. And the non-bankers won this head-or-tail games. If they did it 100 times, they won 52% of the times they had heads and 48 tails. And of course the answer is 50-50, right? If you do this. And so it turns out this is human behavior. You think we can get away with a little lie because you get a little bit of extra money. And so this is who we are, right? As a species. The bankers won 58% of the time. Radically different than but then they did a variation on this. They interviewed the bankers before they played this game, and half of them, so 150, they interviewed about the state of the market, whether they thought stock markets were going to go up, whether they believed in bonds and in put up, and just all this finance industry, blah blah. And the other half, they asked about their last holiday, how their kids were doing, what their favorite book was, human stuff. The ones they interviewed about banking, those were the ones who won 58% of the time. The other half of the bankers won the same 52% of the time as everybody else. And so the outcome of this is that bankers are not more criminal than the average person. But in the context of a bank, they are. So it's the institutional context that incites the criminal behavior. In other words, if you have a banker over for dinner, have a great conversation, it doesn't matter. If you talk to the same person at the bank, beware of what they tell you, because it's very different. So this sort of, this is not a small, I don't lightly paint, this is, is a massive social problem, societal problem. But it's interesting to see that looking at it as a complex system, you see that the social norms are contextual. Right? They're not absolute. Because people can have different social norms in one context or another and behave differently. And so it's the system around them that colors the social norms and that leads to different emergent behavior in banks. And so, then one of the issues of banking policy is, how do you change the manufacturing of those social norms becomes even more important than how do I put rules in place. You can have banking regulation, which is the standard approach. But if actually the problem is one of propagation of social norms, then you have to address that problem and not the rules. So this is again like the obesity. It matters a hell of a lot whether you frame something as a complex system or not, because your interventions will be completely different. Whether it's obesity, whether it's banking, whether it's designing tents, whatever.
Do you have any recommendations for literature about the community effects here, contextual, specific to human communities that have this really?
There's a rather wonderful article that just appeared in Scientific American, which gives a summary of that. After class, I'll look up the summary. It just came out, which sort of gives a nice summary of and of course the literature reference, but it's like a 5-page thing that gives you the modeling and the basic ideas of the social norm. There are also, I mentioned this, the workhorse of complexity as a tool is a thing called agent-based modeling, which allows you to reproduce all of these things, bird flocks, traffic, social norm, contagion, all these kinds of things. And there's an online tool called NetLogo, which you can download, which is actually fairly easy to use, and it has a massive library with bird flock, social norm, contagion, which is all pre-programmed. And then you can tweak things, and you'd say, well, if actually your experiment of, what if male and female birds didn't want to fly close to each other, how would that affect flocking behavior? You could easily experiment. You change the rules and you see what happens. So that's one way of getting into some of these things. And it's not heavy-duty programming. The NetLogo was invented for primary schools. It was invented for 8-year-old kids. And in fact, the agents in all these systems are called turtles, not agents, because they thought kids would take to turtles easily. So that's still the lingo of net logo. It's turtles, not Asians, but it's just essentially Asian. But I'll give you the Scientific American article. Any other final questions, thoughts? No? Well, thank you for your attention, and best of luck with your year here. It sounds like a cool program. Here they go through the various contagion models.
So we're back at 1 o'clock?
For two. Roland, would you like to join us for lunch?
Yeah, that was the idea.
Okay, yeah, all right.
En la cantina is open.
The thing is, like, when we're doing something that was, like, example, with the traffic, same with ours or any regulations, is it probably better to press precautions or something?
You know, this kind of a thing people repeat. Oh, people don't like uncertainty. I'm not sure it's true. And again, the thing is to go back to your private life. Is you chose to come and study here.
Vamos a la
The
cantina.
consequences of this choice, you have knowledge of an idea.
Pizzeria?
You know, should
Pizzeria.
have come to another school, another country. Are you particularly depressed or worried about that? So we're actually remarkably good at and if you speak to refugees, for example, we live in a mind-bogglingly ambiguous world. I mean, humans have a capacity for dealing with uncertainty. And I think we've created this narrative. And our people